Welcome to a moderated discussion with Eric Draper, former Chief White House and personal photographer to President George W. Bush. My name is Fatima Jaffer, and I'm coming to you today from San Antonio. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Texas at Austin. This program you're about to participate in is entitled Through the Lens, Perspectives on an American Presidency, and is proudly being presented to you by the Ismaili Jamatkhana and Center. The Ismaili Jamatkhana's in the United States are more than places of worship and spiritual search. They are places of friendship, dialogue, and inclusivity, reaching out to neighbors to facilitate an exchange of ideas. This is achieved through hosting cultural programs such as educational seminars and lectures, art exhibitions, music and dance, and as a forum for civic leaders and others. At the opening ceremony of the new headquarters of the Global Center for Pluralism on May 16, 2017, the Aga Khan explained, and I quote, "Pluralism does not mean the elimination of difference, but the embrace of difference. Genuine pluralism understands that diversity does not weaken a society, it strengthens it. In an ever-shrinking, ever more diverse world, a genuine sense of pluralism is the indispensable foundation for human peace and progress." End quote. These spaces hope to encourage community engagement and collaboration on issues of concern, as well as broadening intellectual horizons and fostering an appreciation of pluralism. Today is no exception, as we are pleased to present in a moderated discussion with Eric Draper, who served as President George W. Bush's chief photographer for the entire 8 years of his presidency. Eric spent those 8 years photographing President Bush in his daily activities at the office, abroad, and in his personal life. Eric was named Special Assistant to the President and is the first White House photographer to be named a commissioned officer to a U.S. president. Also during his tenure, Eric directed the photographic and archival conversion of the White House photo office from film to digital and took nearly 1 million photos documenting the presidency. Prior to joining the White House, Eric was West Regional Enterprise Photographer for the Associated Press. He has also worked as a staff photographer for the Seattle Times, the Pasadena Star News, and the Albuquerque Tribune. He is currently a freelance corporate and editorial photographer based in Rio Rancho, New Mexico, where he lives with his wife and 2 dogs. Eric is an obsessive LA Laker fan. Today's session will be moderated by Kareem Firshta. Kareem graduated from Harvard Kennedy School with his master's in public policy this May and hails from Sugar Land, Texas. Kareem got started in public service at the Obama White House, where he served as program manager on the presidential transition and personnel teams. In 2018, he was campaign manager for a U.S. congressional race in Texas, executing a 15-language minority voter outreach program. Most recently, he served as national political coordinator for the governor of Montana. He is a Fulbright scholar to Sri Lanka and is a Truman Scholar. Kareem graduated summa cum laude in international affairs from the George Washington University. Without further ado, please enjoy the program.
Thank you so much, Fatma, for that very kind introduction and for emceeing today's event. We're grateful for the great work that you're doing and excited for this conversation today with Eric. I personally am very much looking forward to having Eric join us for this virtual conversation to talk about his experience being at the White House, being President Bush's chief White House official photographer. And I'm excited for a couple of reasons. First, that he's going to help us understand how do we make the White House and the presidency personal. The second piece is Eric just truly has a wealth of experience of understanding and recognizing that his role very much helped shape and define the course of our history. And the third piece is helping to have us kind of get a glimpse into those 8 years into the Bush presidency. So I would love to start us off, Eric, with talking a bit about how you got to the White House. You've had an illustrious career in photojournalism and in photography. Your work spans from being at the Associated Press to covering the Kosovo conflict, from being at the Olympic Games in Sydney to being at the World Cup in France. But after you covered the 1996 election and then into the 2000 elections, you landed one of the most coveted photography positions in the country. And you had the opportunity to serve as President Bush's chief official photographer. If you could, perhaps talk us through your journey in getting to the White House, what drew you to that role, and what compelled you into your career into photography?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to do this presentation. I really enjoy going back and looking at photos, and you know, this amazing job I had for 8 years. Really, it didn't exactly fall into my lap, but it was never really a plan for me to become the White House photographer. It was an opportunity that presented itself, and like you mentioned, I covered presidential campaigns. The first one was in 1996. And when 2000 rolls around, they assigned me to cover Texas Governor George W. Bush. And it was just an assignment like all the others I've had. Never ever thinking I would ever end up in the White House. But it wasn't until after the election, like literally days after the election, which actually the election wasn't decided that night. I don't know if you guys remember that back in 2000 in Austin, Texas. And I was prepared to kind of move on to another assignment. And I was just thinking, just out of curiosity, about who was selected as the White House photographer. Not that I was even interested at that point.
Sure.
And the more I inquired, the more I called around the country. No one knew who was even interested. And so I thought, I wonder if I can get that job. And so I pursued it even more. And I actually, through all the pursuing and calling around the country, I discovered I was invited to a Christmas party, and it was perfect timing. You know, timing is everything. And it was President-elect Bush,
Sure.
because the Supreme Court had just decided the case, and he invited staff and journalists who covered the campaign to Austin, Texas, at the governor's mansion for a Christmas party. And so that's where I decided to make my personal pitch for the job. And so I was prepared. I had a portfolio, and my plan was to walk up to him at the party and ask him for the job, because I knew going to the source would really help. Because President Bush is very personable. I knew it would help, and so my wife and I were there, and my wife was kind of coaching me in the background to make my move. And so I walked up to him and I said, and I looked him in the eye, and I didn't blink, and I said, actually, I pulled the play out of his playbook. And because during the campaign, during his stump speech, which I heard maybe hundreds of times,
Sure.
he would end his speeches by saying, "I'm going to look you in the eye and ask you for the job. I want to be your president." So I said, "Hey, I'm going to take that and say," I looked him in the eye and I said, "I want to be your personal photographer." And he looked at me like he never thought about it before, and he looked away, and he was shaking my hand the whole time. And he said, "You know what? I really appreciate that. I'll get back to you." So a week later, it all happened very, very quickly. I'm back in Austin, Texas, sitting in front of Andy Card, the chief of staff, for the interview. And he pretty much offered me the job on the spot. And his first question was, "Can you manage?" And I said, "Yes, I can," because I was also applying to be the director of the White House photo office. So I had a staff to hire. But there was one phrase he told me that I'll never forget. He said that working at the White House was like trying to drink water through a fire hose at full throttle. And he was right.
Wow. That's quite the experience, and it's always those serendipitous moments, right? When it's least expected that you get to do something that's one of your biggest callings, and feel like your calling into public service has been defined by taking that first step and being able to be to have really that front row seat. I really appreciate just that framing and getting to understand how you landed at the White House. Something that I found particularly unique and inspiring about the Bush presidency was President Bush's ability to make the presidency personal. And I've had the honor of working in the White House as well. And I would love for folks in our audience, our virtual audience, to really understand the presidency from an insider's perspective, a perspective like yours, in which you had so much access to the West Wing and to the decisions that the president was making at the time. And I've always thought that the Bush administration was one that was so personal, yet so powerful. And we often see, the presidency as kind of holding the nation's highest rung of executive leadership, a role that's often larger than life. But President Bush played many roles and wore many hats in addition to being president. He was a father to two amazing daughters, a husband, a dog dad, and of course, for this case, a Texan. So perhaps you could talk us through how did you come into this role to make the Bush presidency accessible to all Americans? In something that I'm sure our audience would be very keen to hear is, how did you begin to portray those values of family, faith, compassion, respect, honesty in the photography that you did during those 8 years?
Well, first of all, I think what people don't understand is every president has a unique relationship with their photographer. And in my case, since I came in as a former journalist, and I've had a very professional relationship, and so we weren't exactly best friends and all that, but I spent a lot of time with them. I spent more time with them than the first lady, I believe, during those 8 years. And you really get to know someone very well. I think they had an advantage, the staff and the president. He knew my personality, he knew my photography, he knew I could fit in. And what I had to discover was what it was like to work directly for a president. And one of the stories I always tell is, I never forget my very first day on the job. I'm standing on the steps of the airplane. Actually, it's not Air Force One yet because he's not president. This was a few days before the inauguration in 2000. And my first day, and I'm standing there just wondering, okay, no one, there's no playbook here. There's no rules. It's like, I'm just going to start following around, right? And so I made a photograph of him walking up the stairs of the plane in Midland, Texas, before he left to become president. And he looked at me and he said, and he's shaking my hand. He woke up, he walked up the stairs, he shook my hand. He said, "Welcome aboard, Eric. We will see everything together. We will see the world." And at that moment, he really set me at ease. And that's one of the gifts that President Bush had in terms of how he connected with people. He was very good at knowing exactly the right thing to say, to break the ice, to make that personal connection. And I watched it for 8 years, from a janitor in the hallway to the king of Saudi Arabia. He treated everyone with respect. He treated everyone. He was able to connect directly with people. And I watched it for 8 years. It was pretty amazing. I think it was a God-given gift he had.
I really appreciate that story that you shared, and just this idea of welcome aboard, because little did you know that those 8 years would be so defining for the course of our country and the course of the presidency. And I remember thumbing through your own book, and it's called, for those who haven't read it yet, it's called Front Row Seat, and it's aptly named because Eric was very much sitting in the front rows of every single conversation, whether they were campaign events or whether they were major triumphant victories of the United States, or some of the more tragic and more somber moments from our nation's history. And you've described yourself at times as the professional observer of the presidency, kind of the living historian of the presidency. So as you go back and think through some of the more consequential moments when President Bush is asked to make some of the most difficult decisions, and then also recounting on those very happy moments of celebrating with the rest of the country, it seems like you get to see the president in this dichotomous role of being both commander-in-chief on the one hand and comforter-in-chief on the other hand. I would love to hear, from a leadership perspective and a decision-making perspective, how did you go about capturing those moments of really collecting history, but also just being in the moment and recognizing and realizing that next snap or next shot that you would take would be in the history books for years and years to come?
Well, I never thought about the history books when I was working. I mean, I knew that, the photos, the moments were important, but I was really focused on just like being there. and capturing the pictures and not really thinking about the aftermath until afterwards. But I think President Bush really trusted my presence. I think he had an understanding of what the White House photographer was all about, and for me, it was all about his comfort level in terms of my presence. And he opened up his life. He opened up his presidency. I mean, I had top secret clearance, which really helped in some situations. Um, but the White House photographer, the role is so unique because everyone in the White House is there to interact with the president, to brief the president, to tell the president what to do. But my job was to be the professional observer. You know, my job was to be quiet, to not interfere. And a lot of people say I was a fly on the wall, but I describe it more like a piece of furniture in the room because they always expected me to be there, and that was the challenging part at the beginning was to just be there at all times so he can get that comfort level. And I could go for 2-3 weeks without saying a word to him, but yet seeing all aspects of his life was really kind of strange, surreal at times. And I was able to observe him so much to the degree that I can just hear the tone of his voice to know what type of mood he was in. I can just see his expression to know almost what he was thinking, not really exactly, but when you watch someone's face and read their moods and their personality so much, you really get to know them, and that's how it was for me.
Wow, that's quite an intimate and personal relationship, and one that other folks would just be so keen to hear about and just to understand where that perspective is coming from. I remember, and I wanted to transition towards you sharing some of these photos because I'm sure that it'll help all of us, go back 8, 10, 15, 16 years now to think about what did it look like and what did it feel like to be in the White House at that time. I remember you mentioned in one of your former interviews that from film to digital, you've taken somewhere along kind of a ballpark estimate of 1 million photographs of the president.
Right.
And that's phenomenal, first of all. Secondly, I'm sure it's hard to pick kind of your top 10, your top 20 photos, but perhaps if we can reminisce and reflect together, would love for you to share as you reflect back on those 8 years in the White House and traveling with the president across the country and across the world, what are some of those defining moments from the Bush era? I'll stop talking now. Perhaps we can transition to bringing on your slide deck, and would love if you could provide some color and context to what was going on in those 8 years.
I'd love to, yeah. And this is my favorite part, is showing the pictures. So, can you see the first slide?
I can.
Okay, so having this very unique job. Oh, by the way, I'm the person second from the left in this picture, just in case you don't recognize me. But it was really a incredible 8 years. And just a bit of shameless plug here. This is my book, Front Row Seat, which you mentioned. It was a book that I published back in 2013, and I timed it with the opening of the Presidential Library, which at that time everyone was looking back. But I'm very, very proud of this body of work. And when I talk about history, this was actually the first few moments of the president entering the Oval Office on day one. This was January 20th, 2001. The president sitting at the Oval Office desk for the very first time, joined by his father, President H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, and what you have here is a unique moment. You have a father and son moment. You have two presidents, historic because they're only the second president, son of a president to become president. The first being John Q. Adams, and then you have the kind of the story behind the story. So you see that cord coming from the chair. That was a massage chair that was left there, and the president is turning it on at this moment. That's what's kind of leading to the laughter. And of course, anytime they were together, to me, was like this magical moment. It was always historic, because they look so alike, first of all. And one of the things you realize when you say Mr. President, they both turn around. So Sometimes you have to refer to them as President 41 and President 43 when they're together. This is a portrait I made of both presidents at Camp David in 2008, because I really wanted to show that father-son bond, which they really had, and again, just historic, two presidents together. And President Bush would have lunch with his father, and this is in the private dining room adjacent to the Oval Office. Karim, I don't think did you ever go in there when you were at the White House?
No, I didn't.
Okay. But anyway, that portrait hanging on the wall there, that's John Q. Adams. Again, that's the first son of a president to become president. And President Bush really admired him, so he had that sitting there the entire 8 years. And again, this is a family moment. We talked about the president being a father and a dog owner, but he was also a son, and he was all about family, and he was all about faith, family, and friends. Those three themes were strong throughout his presidency and throughout his life. A nice moment with his mother in the Oval Office. And moving on to his relationship with Mrs. Bush, which actually this is not an illustration of the relationship. They're a lot closer than this. But this is a kind of a fun moment inside Buckingham Palace where the president and the first lady were kind of playing around like kids. They're asking me to take their photos all over the building there in Buckingham Palace. And Buckingham Palace is like the White House, but bigger, as you can see. But this is more of their relationship, which is very warm, very loving. And the president always described their relationship as becoming stronger through the trials of the presidency. And he was really, you can tell in public, they really bonded a lot. And of course, the president had a great sense of humor, sometimes at the expense of the first lady. And of course, the twins, Jenna and Barbara. And this is when they're teenagers, way back in 2001. And watching them grow up in the White House is very, very interesting. The president with Barbara. And a moment with Jenna, the other twin. And the president loved his ranch, the Western White House, where he would always go fishing with his favorite fishing buddy, Barney, the presidential dog, one of the Scottish Terriers that he had during the 8 years. He always called Barney the son he never had. He really had a good time with Barney. And then the second dog was Miss Beasley, who, here's a quick moment in the Oval Office. And a lot of these moments would happen in between of all the structure and all the protocol. And the president's schedule was like down to the minute in terms of what he had to do day by day. And occasionally when the president would have personal time, and it would last as 2 or 3 minutes where he can get a breather or bring the dog in. And the president had a lot of emotion, a lot of care for the soldiers that were in the wars that happened during his presidency. He would always say that he wanted to look the parents and the soldiers in the eye to tell them exactly why he made the decisions that he made. And in this case, this is the picture here of this soldier. He just gave this soldier a Purple Heart, and he kissed him on his forehead. And you talked about the comforter in chief, and the president would spend a lot of time with the families of the injured soldiers and families of the fallen. This is the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in Mississippi. And I go back to the very first day. This is the president entering the Oval Office for the very first time. And the Oval Office was really an amazing place because all walks of life would come through the Oval Office.
Sure.
And one of my favorite things to do is just to capture that those first moments of the people walking through the front door, or the official door of the Oval Office, from a Boy Scout to an old friend from Texas.
Sure.
to a new world leader. This is President Karzai when he was just elected the president of Afghanistan.
Absolutely. Well, if I could pause you for a second. I remember vividly that moment when I stepped into the Oval for the first time, and I would love to hear your reflections when you stepped into the Oval for the first moment. How did you feel? I mean, we know how the president felt because you captured that, but how did you feel going into a role that would define your career?
That's a great question, and sometimes photographers experience moments differently because they're so focused on the reactions of the subject matter. And in my case, my first moments in the Oval Office, I actually backpedaled through the front door of the Oval Office. That picture of the president walking through the door. So I'm walking in backwards, watching the president react to the Oval Office. And for me, it was more like tunnel vision, just watching the president's reaction. And then once I put the camera down, realizing where I was, I mean, it was just this amazing experience to know how much history that I was standing in, right in the center. And it was really kind of mind blowing. But of course, I had to put my mind back into what I was doing and focus on the pictures, which sometimes was easy, especially when you're dealing with a lot of emotion. Where I was able to kind of use the camera as a shield in some cases to really focus on making the picture. And like this picture here, this is a great illustration of how timely President Bush was. I always like to call this photo "Timing is Everything." And the kind of goofy moments in the White House that kind of just happen just out of the blue, and like I said, just waiting around for the surprise moments. That was what I enjoyed the most. And President Bush here has just received a boxing robe as a gift, and he's looking around to show it off to people. And of course, I mentioned Crawford, Texas. He was very proud of his ranch, and the president was really a Texan at heart. And he used the ranch to recover, to become grounded again. And he would invite friends and family, and of course, world leaders would go to the ranch where they were able to see the president in a more personal way. And in this picture here, the timing of this picture is interesting. This is a picture was made in August of 2001, a month before 9/11. And so every time I see this photo, I see a sense of innocence before the world changed. And speaking of 9/11, the next series of pictures are photos that I made on that day of the president and some of the days that followed. And you guys might remember the famous whisper in the ear that Andy Card, and the president's face changed dramatically. Well, I knew something was wrong. I didn't know exactly what was happening. We had heard that the first tower had been hit, but everyone thought it was this horrific accident. And walking into the hold room here and showing this picture here, this is the hold room adjacent to the classroom, and that TV is showing the live pictures of the burning towers, where both towers are on fire at that moment. And the president was really just kind of sprung into action. I was waiting for him to look up at the television here. That I was just kind of just frozen watching what I couldn't believe on TV. But the president picked up the notepad and started collecting his thoughts to make his first statement to the nation and to the world. And this is before the smartphone, before the iPhone. So everyone had pagers and cell phones, and they were trying to gather information for the president during this time. This is just a few minutes after the second tower was hit. And we hadn't actually seen that footage of the second tower and that huge fireball that's burned into everyone's memory. And it wasn't until this moment when the president finally saw it. And Dan Bartlett, the president's communications director, is pointing to the TV when they're replaying the second tower getting hit. And the president finally turns to see that image. And everything was focused on New York. And we didn't know exactly what was to come. So by the time we arrived on Air Force One, we had learned that the Pentagon was hit. We learned that Flight 93 was still airborne. headed toward the White House. We also learned that the vice president was evacuated to a secure location. And what's happening in this picture here is President Bush is having an argument with Andy Card, and he's telling him that he wants to go back to Washington. And Andy Card is literally telling him that he couldn't go back; it wasn't safe enough. And it was very heated. It was very tense, and all the discussion aboard the airplane turned to the president's safety because we didn't know exactly where we were headed. We learned later that Air Force One flew out and circled the Gulf of Mexico before we realized which way we were headed. And that's what's going on here in this picture here. That's Andy Card discussing with the Secret Service agents and the military aide about where it was safe, where to keep the president safe. And this is a moment here, the president's being told that we couldn't return to Washington, and he was very upset. Around this time, we heard that Flight 93 had crashed. In this picture here, the president is watching the Twin Towers collapse. And our first stop on that day was Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. And I thought my story would be over at this stage. I mean, the president got into a car and he sped off and disappeared. But I was able to catch up with him later, and he just sat down for his first briefing of the situation, and he's kind of hooked up via teleconference to all the agencies. And we're on the ground in Louisiana for a couple of hours, and you can see the frustration building on the president's face. He really wanted to get back to Washington. He really wanted to lead from the Oval Office. He didn't want to look like he was on the run. Our second stop that day was Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. And again, the president is behind those doors receiving a top secret briefing. And here the president is on the phone with the vice president. And, we finally learned that we're headed back to Washington late afternoon that day on 9/11. And for me personally, my wife had just moved to DC 5 days prior to 9/11. So it was like, welcome to Washington, honey, right? And they didn't allow us to call from the airplane until later. And I never forget calling from Air Force One. I told my wife when she answered the phone that I was going to be a little late tonight, and I can hear her laughing through her tears. As we approached Washington, the president and the staff noticed the fighter jets escorting Air Force One. And they had been with us the entire day, but we didn't see them until we were landing at Andrews Air Force Base. And this is really hit home what was happening that day. We had the fighter jets nearly touching the wing on the left side of the plane, and out of the right side of the plane, you can see the plume of smoke still rising from the Pentagon. And the president was finally back at the White House that early evening and was finally able to visit directly in person with the vice president, who had been holed up in the POC, the Presidential Operations Center, which no one really knew about until 9/11, under the White House. The next morning, this is September 12th, and that's Condoleezza Rice, who was the National Security Advisor for the president at that time, watching the sun rise, and the president is on the phone with Tony Blair, his first call of the day. This is a scene outside the Oval Office. This is the outer Oval Office where the president's personal secretary sits, and that's the vice president on the phone. And you can see the headlines from that day, the newspapers there on the right.
So if we could just take a quick pause there.
Okay. And would you like me to continue, or?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Oh, I can hear you now.
Okay. I was saying we've gone through. You're in a classroom in Florida. You're going to Louisiana, to Nebraska, and then to DC. It's kind of going back to that first picture that you showed, that moment of innocence that we see at the Western White House, and into the White House the very next day with Condoleezza Rice in the Oval. What's gone through your head as you go to bed that night?
I was still kind of shell shocked, to be honest. And one of the things about witnessing so many events in a single day, and 9/11 was just off the charts, is that I wasn't able to really digest what I just witnessed until like several days afterwards to really understand what really happened. I was just running on pure adrenaline, and my job
Sure.
was really focused on the president's emotion. And but I was like everyone else. Everyone has a story that day of where they were and how they felt. And um, just like everyone, it really felt horrific. Like a gut punch, and everyone wanted to know why and who, and I had all those emotions, but I had to kind of put them away to really focus on the job. But it took a while to really understand what I was witnessing, especially going back to look through the photos, and a lot of the emotions that I captured really kind of helped me deal with it as well.
And if I could stop you, because you play two roles here. You play the role of the president's photographer, but also the role of managing the White House photo office. So how are you communicating back to your staff and relaying to them that while you've been with the president, there's really the tides of this nation have turned and have catapulted you into a role in which you're going to be at Camp David, in the Situation Room, and in places where you used to be a lot, but definitely a lot more in the next few days and months to come. So how are you communicating back to your staff and relaying a sense of calm and ease while there's so much chaos and tension?
Well, I think everyone stepped up during 9/11, and I think all we could do was focus on our jobs. And what you learn is, the White House in itself, you're working with the best and the brightest. And for me, it was just crystal clear what I had to do, and that was not have the president leave my sight as much as possible. And I had a great staff who understood the moment as well. A lot of former journalists I brought in to handle my images, to know exactly what to do with them. And I had a lot of trust in my staff to handle those pictures. But it was really just dealing with it day by day, minute by minute, as just a huge historic news event that was just went on and on. There's really no end to the story of 9/11, because the president's his presidency changed in seconds that day, where it was all focused on keeping America safe. And it was really you can see it on his face, you can see it in his personality, um, how focused he was. But also, the president is human. He I captured him going through a lot of emotions in terms of meeting people, and as you go on, you'll see some of that emotion. Like here, the president jumping ahead to September 14th, the day of national prayer, and the president had just spoken to the audience inside the National Cathedral, and he delivered his address, and his father reached over to shake his hand. We traveled to New York City that day, to Ground Zero, and that was just an incredible experience, being on the ground, being in front of that disaster, and seeing the rubble, which was like 3 or 4 stories high, and you can still feel the heat from the fire. And I never forget, as we approached Ground Zero aboard Marine One, the cabin filled with smoke that was still coming from the rubble. And that's the president there touring the site with the governor of New York, and um, but also meeting the firefighters, which you may not remember this, but at this time 3-4 days after 9/11, no survivors are being found, and the firefighters had been there day after day, hour after hour during the recovery, and that you can tell that they were tired, they were frustrated, and you can feel anger as well because they really wanted the president to do something, and the president immediately started wading through the crowd. It was like we're standing on a raw nerve, and the president really delivered when he took the megaphone, and he's standing there with the retired firefighter Bill Beckwith, and the firefighters were shouting. This is a pure organic moment when a staff member at the White House handed the bullhorn to the president, just the last second decision. And the firefighters are screaming, "I can't hear you." And he said the famous line, "I can hear you. The world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear from all of us soon." And the crowd just erupted in chants of USA, USA. And you could tell he really lifted the spirits of the firefighters. And I, photographing all these historic moments, sometimes you don't know when something is historic, but at that moment, I could feel, the hair on my neck rising, knowing that that was definitely a historic moment.
Yeah, I would love to pause you right there because that photo is one that no one can forget. I mean, every time we commemorate the loss of lives that took place on 9/11, this picture comes up over and over again. As you've reflected on the year since 9/11 and have seen these pictures come up year in and year out, what goes through your mind every year we go through 9/11 and as you kind of reminisce and try to recollect your thoughts of what was going on that day now 19, 20 years later?
Well, every time I see this picture, I just see leadership. I see someone stepping up to the plate and really delivering. I see someone who was there not only as a leader, but as someone with compassion to understand what people were going through. And the president had that ability to really, like I said before, connect with people. And like in this picture here, the president is meeting with the family members of people that were missing. And he walked into this huge room of like 300 people. And on the schedule, it was down for like 20 minutes, meeting with the families. But the president spent nearly 3 hours hugging, crying, and laughing with every person in that room. And this is probably the most difficult thing I've ever had to photograph in terms of just the sadness going on in this room. There are people walking around with pictures of their loved ones who are missing. They're walking around with handwritten signs. Have you seen my mother? Have you seen my brother? This picture here, this is the mother of a fallen Port Authority officer, George Howard. And Arlene Howard here is giving the president a badge that her son wore when he died on 9/11. And the president carried this badge in his hand. I made a photograph in the Oval Office weeks later, but he carried around this badge to tell the personal story of from 9/11. And he would always pull it out to tell the story of George Howard whenever he would talk to people directly and personally in a room. And he carried around this badge for weeks. And it was very important to him to tell that story. Well, jumping ahead to one of my favorite subjects, which I think what I'll miss the most is traveling on Air Force One. I really wish I would have been able to get air miles during all that travel. I traveled to 70 countries with President Bush. And Air Force One is like a flying White House. You can almost do anything on that airplane, including the president loved to exercise. This is in Normandy, France, during the anniversary of D-Day. The president visiting Albania. And this is I've never seen this before in terms of just the crowd just wanting to put their hands on the president. And I always wonder what was going on through the minds of these agents standing nearby. And the president had lots of relationships he developed through the years with world leaders. One of his favorite leaders here is Prime Minister Koizumi from Japan. The president meeting with the Queen and Prince Philip. And I'll tell you a quick story about how unusual my job was, kind of embarrassing in a way, because on this day, the Queen was visiting the White House after several years, and after the arrival ceremony on the South Lawn, and Mrs. Bush wanted to take the Queen up to the residence. So I'm like thinking, oh, this is great. I'm following the Queen, and Mrs. Bush says, oh, let's go see the Queen's room in the residence. And that's actually named after the Queen. And so I'm on the heels of the Queen, following her. And what I realize is I'm following the Queen into the restroom. And so I did an about face, realizing what I was getting into. So I had to leave. So I'm doing an about face, and there's Prince Philip standing right in front of me with a straight face. And he said, are you following them to the loo? And then all of a sudden he kind of burst out in laughter. And luckily I avoided an international incident.
That's quite the story.
Yeah. This is the president during one of the Middle East peace summits in Egypt. And a lot of things happen behind the scenes that are just kind of hard to explain. Like here, this is President Bush with Prime Minister Olmert in Israel. And Olmert wanted to find out who was taller right before they walked out for a press conference. The president in Australia with Prime Minister Howard, visiting the new Pope, Pope Benedict in Rome, meeting the new Prime Minister Gordon Brown in London at 10 Downing. And on the right there, that's the former Prime Minister Blair, who had just stepped down. And this photo here was kind of symbolic at the time. This is right before the president stepped down, before leaving office. And at the time, President Putin was prime minister of Russia, and he was about to step down in that role. And they're walking alone, and that's the Dead Sea in the background. And another historic moment. This is President-elect Obama sitting in the Oval Office for the first time, and this is the so-called transition meeting that happens after every election. And President-elect Obama was just elected president at that time, just a week before, and I actually had set up a remote camera to capture this image of the two of them alone, and I set it up on the mantle of the Oval Office. So you might remember that picture. Oh, you have a question?
Yeah, if I could pause you and go back to that
Sure.
moment, because at this point, 8 years have passed, and you've been in the White House for 8 years. So what does it feel like from those first moments that you step into the Oval Office and to one of the very last moments in which you'll be there? What's emerged for you as a person and as a photographer?
Yeah, that's a perfect lead way into this picture here. This is the president leaving the Oval Office for the last time, and for me, it was kind of bittersweet. It was mixed emotions, knowing that it was my last day, knowing that I wouldn't see a lot of the people for the last time for a long time, and that my time has come to an end. A job, the hardest job that I ever loved. It was one of those kind of moments, and so I had a lot of mixed feelings. I was exhausted. I was the first chief photographer to actually finish all 8 years from beginning to end. So I was definitely ready for rest, but at the same time, it was a kind of just mixed emotions that day. And for the president, just like true to his personality, he was very direct that morning. It was around 8 o'clock, and I kind of expected more emotion out of this moment, but all the president did was he called for his coat and he put it on and he said, "I'm heading over," and he walked out without looking back. So that's my last slide.
Wow, that is a tremendous presentation and a slideshow that will it's truly left me stunned and without words. First off, thank you for your years and years of service to our country and to a presidency that has defined the course of our nation. a president who has been able to show us compassion and kindness in some of the most arduous moments that require steady-handed leadership, and for you to be behind the scenes and to share these very intimate, personal, real, sentimental moments is just a true delight to our audience and to our community. So I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to you.
You're welcome.
I want to touch on something that you just mentioned, which I thought was something that quite literally could be a headline: the hardest job I ever loved. I often think about, those last moments when I was in the White House, and you often say, like, it's been an honor of a lifetime, right? But it's also this difficulty with which you say that, right? Because for you, it's those very late nights and very early mornings. It's this deep sense of patriotism and a personal sense of pride. So as you begin to square what you did for 8 years in retrospect, what about the job did you end up loving so much?
Well, I think it was just the experience. I mean, the unique position to be in, to see the perspective of the presidency from that angle. And not only just the president's story, but watching everyone around the president and seeing their stories. I mean, my camera was mostly focused on the president, but anytime I would turn the camera around and see other people involved, it was truly there was a story everywhere, and I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the friendships that I made during the 8 years, and my friendship with President Bush as well. And I think I'll miss those hot days at the ranch, sweating it out. I miss traveling with all the friends that all the generations of staff, and watching them grow up through the years.
Sure.
There's a lot of, I think the friendships is what I'll miss the most.
So I want to also touch on this piece of, you had a front row seat, and now you're no longer there, and you're kind of an observer of presidential photography of the 8 years of kind of the Obama administration and into the new. As you look at presidential photography and the role that it plays in shaping our values, what strikes you as some of the most important qualities of having that job, and in making sure that you're just not a documentarian or a historian, but someone who embodies the values of the administration that you serve? And I think that really speaks to the essence of the Ismaili Jamatkhana and Center, right? One that's grounded on the values of pluralism, of faith, of compassion, of respect, and of just true thought-provoking questions. So as you go back and look at those 8 years, you said for the presidency, it was, faith, family, friends. But for you, what are those values that have defined your work in photography?
Well, for me, capturing authentic, honest pictures, uh, that was really important to me, and not exactly going into it with a certain frame of mind. I mean, I tried to capture everything in terms of the aspects of the presidency, even some of the bad pictures and some of the really hard moments. To me, it was important to tell a well-rounded story as much as possible. And the unique position I had, I was able to see those stories, and hopefully, the visual narrative that I created, that archive, you can go back and actually have a better understanding of what happened, but an honest representation of what happened.
I really appreciate those thoughts. And as we begin to close out this conversation, for folks who are aspiring photographers and photojournalists, who are listening in and have aspirations to be the next Eric Draper, and have aspirations to be the next Pete Souza, what is your advice to folks who see photography and photojournalism and journalism more broadly as kind of a conduit to the work that they want to do in the careers that they hope to build?
Well, I always tell photographers to never underestimate themselves, to always ask questions. And for me, the question about, I want to be a photographer. And that answer was yes. And all I had to do was ask, and look what happened. So I think that's the biggest advice is always ask, because what's the worst can happen?
That's always been advice that I've heeded, and it seems like you have too. We probably have another 2 or 3 minutes in this conversation, and I know it's going to make ripples across our community, and folks are going to be listening to this for days and weeks to come, just to reflect on the strength in the message and the vision that you've shared of the Bush presidency, but also how you've made it personal and how you've shared those ways to balance, the professional and the presidential. So as we wrap up, what are some of your takeaway thoughts for someone who's listening to this presentation, and as they reflect on photography and the presidency, what would you want to leave them with, since you've seen it so up close and personal?
Well, I think people can see that they can understand the power of photography. The fact that being there to capture these pictures are really important, and that in every presidency, that president. So in my example, President Bush allowed me to be there. It was his choice. He opened his life to capture these stories to tell later for historians to study, and that's important. So every administration has that question of how much will be seen, how much will be captured, how many stories will be told. But it's up to that president to decide, really, because what people don't understand is that you serve at the pleasure of the president. You're not there as a journalist. You're not there as for yourself. I mean, you're there to serve the president, and so that was most important in order to maintain that trust throughout all of these emotional roller coaster of events and history and travel. It's a lot. It really is a lot.
Well, I just want to say thank you again. You've given us a treat today, a snapshot into 8 years of history making, a ability to see through with the foresight that you had of brighter days to come and a better country that we could build together, and to always know that our best days are ahead of us, not behind us. And as a country, we will grow, and your photography will inspire folks for years and years to come. And as we look back to those moments after 9/11 or after Katrina, and even into moments of transition, that we will have, historical record keeping and presidential record keeping that's going to stay with us for centuries after both of us have left. So I'm grateful that you shared your time with us. I know a lot of what you've shared lives in your book and in the Presidential Library, which I hope many folks will purchase and others will go visit in Dallas once our cities open up. But Eric, from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of our entire community, we're so grateful to you for your time, for your talent, and for sharing this treasure with us. And I hope this conversation inspires those who are in Houston, who are in Texas, and across the country.
Thank you very much. I hope so.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for a truly insightful discussion. Having the opportunity to explore your unique perspective as chief photographer during such a continuous and defining period in the nation was quite enlightening. On the behalf of the Ismaili Jamatkhana and Center, we also want to thank each and every one of you that joined virtually from your homes across the country and the globe. We hope that you found the program to be as valuable as we did. To get more information about the Ismaili Jamatkhana and Center, please go to the.ismaili in your web browser. And for more information on upcoming programming, please go to facebook.com/theismailiusa. We look forward to sharing future programming with you. Thank you and good evening.